And we are going. So whenever you're ready.
I think we're ready. Thanks, Dr. S. Good evening. My name is Jesse Garn with Group 1. It's our pleasure to present to you about Active Server Pages, or ASP. Our first presenter will be Dylan Connor, who will explain some of the tech specs of ASP.
Thank you for that, Jesse. So let's go ahead and talk about the technical specifications here. The server itself can run on Windows OS or Windows Server because it needs that .NET framework. The apps, however, can run on the Windows, Linux, and other operating systems that are available on the market. If you're doing like the scripting part, I know Visual Studio, where you do most of your scripting, or C# writing, can be done in Windows, Linux, or a Mac. The server minimum requirements is a Pentium 133 megahertz processor, which is not really that fast, but it gets the job done. 128 megabytes of RAM, and I couldn't find any actual minimum hard disk or hard drive space. Typically, most people will probably have a couple of terabytes of hard disk or hard drive space to use. For the client side, a Pentium 90 megahertz processor will suffice. You have 32 megabytes of RAM, and as well as no minimum hard drive space. At least have enough for the operating system and a few applications to run is pretty much all you need. Now, I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Pharaoh.
Thank you, Dylan. As far as the costs required was ASP, the cost involved with coding ASP will depend on the cost required for purchasing the different versions of the Microsoft Visual Basic / Visual Studio programs. And that's because those programs are required to code ASP. They are a requirement for coding that specific language. And the cost can range in the hundreds of dollars depending on the purchased versions of the different Microsoft Visual Studio / Visual Basic programs. You can either get one or two versions, or you can get multiple versions. It depends on how much you code and what you need to code. As far as purchasing the latest version of Visual Studio 2017, you have to make a payment of $499, and that's just to purchase the professional 2017 standalone license. To be able to purchase Visual Studio Professional subscriptions through the Microsoft Developer Network, you would have to pay around it's precisely $1,199. You can also go for cloud subscriptions as well through the Visual Studio Marketplace, and that can range. That you can either pay monthly payments or you can pay annual payments. For the monthly payments, it would be $45 a month, and that will be billed every month. Or you can go for annual payments, which is going to be $539 for the whole year, and that can be an annual subscription. For you to be able to develop the skill set for ASP, you have to learn how to use Visual Basic and Visual Studio. The more learning that you do, the more experience you get using those specific programs, then the better the skill set you're going to have for ASP. And that's it for the costs. I'm going to pass it on to Jackie.
Thank you, Pharaoh. I'm going to be discussing the features of ASP.NET and just how those differentiate it from the other programs available. One of the most interesting things that exist within ASP is that it allows you to use a large database of existing functions called the class library. And essentially what that means is there is existing code that has been written by Microsoft developers that they have in large blocks that can be attached to something called the data grid to create the application pages. And this just makes things a lot simpler. Another interesting feature that differentiates ASP is something called object-oriented programming that just allows for more organization within the code with more complex applications and the functions that they require as things get more complicated as we develop more and more technology. Another feature of ASP is something called web services. Essentially what this means is that sections of code can be stored in servers regardless of the geographic area, and they'll be pulled up simultaneously as needed by the application. So that's really interesting and really allows for just smoother operation or usage of ASP.NET in application building. Another interesting feature that is very helpful for large projects is that ASP.NET can also be used with multiple coding languages. So every page has to be in a single language, but not every page within an application has to be written by the same language. So this makes it very convenient for, like I said, large projects. I am going to pass it off to Jesse for our next section.
Thanks, Jackie. So perception was a little tough, you know, especially based on the fact that I've got no perception of my own before we started this project. So all of my research was to find out other people's opinions on ASP, and I found them to be all over the board. And it seems people either really like it or they really dislike it. For end users, ASP allows for some really nice dynamic interactive web content. So controls can provide interfaces to do things such as virtually dissect a cat within a web page, or even create interactive forums. And these things, you know, make more efficient use of your time, and end users seem to like that. On the other hand, these same controls have a bit of a reputation for being flaky, or at the very least picky about which web browser you use to access the site. This can be the cause of some frustration for end users. On the programmer side, ASP is a great tool for programmers that are fluent in some other language, such as VBScript or JavaScript, as these are the scripting languages used in ASP. Again, on the other hand, and I'm not a programmer, but I read that VBScript can be difficult to learn as a newbie because it's very picky. For example, a common gripe was that you must pre-declare all your variables. And finally, ActiveX and JavaScript, because they run like small programs on your computer, can be used by bad guys to spread malware or for other nefarious purposes, and they have a lot recently. It's for that reason that these browser add-ons aren't considered very secure and are potentially an avenue of attack. That's it for perception. I'll now turn it over to Sam, who will be covering ASP user interface. Sam?
Thanks, Jesse. Okay, for the user interface, it's very simple. For the Windows interface, this is what the window looks like, and there is the code is C#, and Visual Studio is the integrated development environment that developers can use to make web pages for ASP. Next slide, please. Some of the features include, is it intuitive? Well, it is as intuitive as the user interface can be, considering that developing has to be logical. So making a interface that is logical and intuitive can be hard, but it is pretty intuitive. And how is it intuitive? Well, when you're developing, it allows it for quicker development with your keystrokes, because it auto-completes some of the most common variables, or it helps you correct syntax errors, not semantic errors. Those are pretty hard to detect. Also helps debug. It includes an emulating system for web pages, as most IDEs do, I believe. And it also allows for collaboration on places like GitHub and other repositories. Next slide, and another. Oh, this is the syntax. This is what ASP code would look like, and what's in red, the rest of the code is HTML. And then next slide, please. Here we can see what the IDE looks for Mac. This was, I am uncertain on when exactly it was released for Mac, but I know that this is a new thing that Microsoft has implemented for developers that own Mac OS and develop in a Mac environment. And lastly, there's an IDE for Linux. As a matter of fact, there's an IDE for just about every operating system. And that's all for the user interface. And now with that, I'll pass it on to Jackie.
Thanks, Sam. Next, I'm going to be talking about the scalability of ASP.NET and some of the characteristics that can actually limit that. One of the first characteristics that limit scalability with ASP is that the pre-coded modules that exist when you first begin to write a page or an application. Some of them aren't necessarily needed in a lot of applications, and so those actually have to be coded and to be removed because they're a little redundant. The format in which pages are loaded with each page request requires a new session to be created for each execution, and this can really create bottlenecks when there's high amounts of usage. And lastly, database trips that are required when using applications that use date or time specific services and booking those. A lot of communication is required between the application and the existing database to just make sure that overbookings and that sort of thing aren't occurring. And then if pricing changes are based on like Uber's pricing, for instance, that's requiring a lot of communication between the server and the application because they have the surge pricing. Same thing applies in other similar uses. So essentially, all this back and forth also creates a bottleneck that can really limit the ability to scale using ASP. And I believe that does finish our presentation. Thank you so much. I think Jesse is going to finish us out.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. That's the end of our presentation of ASP. We hope you found this to be informative. We thank you for your time, and we'll turn it back over to Dr. S.
Okay, okay, just stopped recording. So, good job. Let me ask this question: What was the most valuable thing that you think you learned out of about ASP?
For me, that you can use multiple coding languages to create an application that even if the pages are written in the same language, you can have multiple coders with different references working on the same project.
Others?
I guess I learned a little bit more about ActiveX controls and the way they interact with your machine. I knew that there was a lot of security concerns that surrounding ActiveX controls. Basically, it's up to the end user to decide whether or not to run it, and that's just a huge hole. And there's some filters you can install for your browser and whatnot. It's really a huge security concern that I'd heard about, but now I know more about.
Okay.
I personally learned that not all languages are created equal. I used to think that all languages were programming languages, but then during this project I learned that there are scripting languages, and I already knew HTML wasn't a programming language. It was more of what is it like, to format a page language. And I didn't realize that ASP and JSP and other languages are just for scripting, are to make more of a small application to interact with users over the web. I used to think they were all, you could accomplish anything with all the languages, but I think now I'm starting to learn that you need the right tool for the right job and to do background work in order to know that.
Okay, good.
For me, I learned how expensive Visual Studio can be. But the good thing about the pricing that Microsoft has for Visual Studio is that you can have it flexibly through different platforms or different methods of payment, especially the cloud services. Like the cloud services through Microsoft, those are very flexible ways of getting Visual Studio and implementing it and effectively paying for it as well, through the monthly payment plans and the annual payment plans. So for any developer, especially someone like myself, I develop, and sometimes I can use Visual Studio. I don't have to purchase the whole version right away and pay so much money for it right away. I can just use monthly payments or the annual payments, depending on my need, to be able to use it effectively without having to pay too much money.
Good job. Just so everybody's aware, you do have access to Visual Studios through Microsoft Imagine. So if you're not aware of that, go download it and play with it. Even if you don't want to play with it right now, download it so you've got it later. There's a lot of cool stuff up there. They don't have everything, but there's a lot of stuff there. So now I guess the just the last couple of questions I have really are more about formatting and all that kind of stuff. What do you think about presenting this way? Do you like collaborating this way, presenting this way? Is it something you'd rather, record presentations ahead of time and send me a link to something that's pre-recorded, or do you like the interactivity? And would you rather get rid of presentations altogether or have face-to-face classes?
I don't mind answering if you don't mind. I think this is awesome. I really like that it's live. My personality would mean that if I was recording ahead of time, I would probably spend 3 hours making it perfect. And I think this is cooler that you can actually see it real time. And I would much rather do this than face to face or a paper or anything else. So I think you got it down.
Okay.
I agree with Jesse.
Okay.
Yeah, I like the online format. It's just like taking online classes much more flexible for me. It allows me to study on my own pace, and especially if you have a heavy load of work schedules and all that kind of stuff, taking online classes can be very helpful than face to face. Especially if you're better at studying on your own. And having a presentation like this, I mean, it allows for interactivity, being able to communicate with your classmates, and at the same time, it allows you to be able to be more productive, especially when you're working in smaller groups than having face-to-face classes where you can have so many different students at the same time. So it allows for more efficiency